And hello again. The image I picked for the background is a sketch done by Captain John Rogers Vinton in the Second Seminole War. You see Fort Mellon back there behind me, steamboat on the river. Uh, Actually, Captain Vinton was on this battle we're going to talk about tonight at the Battle of Camp Monroe in 1837. I'm going to read to you from a diary of a soldier that participated there. But before I begin, some people have asked me about the Seminole clothing that I wear. This is the desert camouflage Seminole clothing. They do have veterans outfits, and being a Desert Storm veteran myself, I picked this up in the 1990s. The craftswoman who sewed it was Margaret Cypress from Immokalee, and I love the fact that I know who made it. So it's always been kind of special, even though it's getting a little worn after 25 years. Um, the veteran I'm going to talk about is 200 years earlier than this time. Uh, it is Private Bartholomew Lynch. This was originally a master's thesis done by Felix P. McGaughey Jr. for FSU in 1965. There's only two copies, one at FSU and one at USF in Tampa. And so very few people have read it. It would be great if it can be reprinted by the Seminole Wars Foundation as an eyewitness account. It's called the Squaw Kissing War, Bartholomew Lynch's Journal of the Second Seminole War, 1836 to 1839. If I would reprint it, I'd probably change the name, of course. Now, Bartholomew Lynch, his journal that this author got a hold of, Lynch was a soldier in the Second Dragoon Regiment. The regiment was created in 1836 and was the elite fighting force in the U.S. Army at the time. They were armed by Hall's carbine breech-loading rifles, which the men hated, and I'll mention that in the journal here. The Second Dragoon Regiment was created, and 10 companies were recruited by officers. Many of these officers were not regular Army officers. They were from state militia. Bartholomew Lynch, he mentions that he was recruited by Captain William Tompkins in New York City. He calls Tompkins the kidnapper general. So Bartholomew Lynch, although he was a common laborer from Ireland, he's very literate. He writes quite well. He's very sarcastic. He's very critical of the officers and the men, and paints a very grim picture of Army life, showing that it's quite a different Army back then, almost 200 years ago, than it is today. So you'll see what I'm talking about from the very start of this. The men are recruited with the company, and they go to Fort Columbus on Governor's Island, New York. The fort is still there today, but it's called Fort J, and it's a New York City park. For a while after the Army gave it up, it was, various functions. I have a coworker who was actually there as a kid. His father was in the Coast Guard before it became a park. Okay, Bartholomew Lynch and his company, after training, being dressed and recruited and armed, they left New York on a steamboat down the East Coast off of Cape Hatteras. Then they went to Charleston. So I'll start there right before they get to Florida. We were off Charleston Harbor. No pilot was available. Blew a hurricane, we could not get in, wind off the land. It's not hurricane season, so he means a gale or nor'easter, very strong wind, which is typical of the wintertime on the East Coast. January 1st, 1837. We took a pilot this morning, went to sea, cast anchors, very uncomfortable. Ship miserable, dirty, officers careless, never inquire about the men. Could not get in until the 8th of January. January 8th, 1837, which in fact was a holiday back at that time. The 8th of January was a holiday commemorating the Battle of New Orleans that was observed up until the Civil War. Landed at Castle Pinckney, crowded into very narrow quarters there. Our orderly sergeant and Buck, another sergeant, obtained a pass to go to Charleston. They stole our rations. We were in a hungry state. Some men in F Company quarreled. Lieutenant Howe put them in irons. Castle Pinckney is a brick fortification in Charleston Harbor, besides Fort Sumter and Fort Moultrie. Excuse me a minute. And it is a very small, miserable half circle of a fort. It's abandoned today, and you can only get there by watercraft. It's on a barrier island. And the Lieutenant Howe he is talking about is Marshal Howe, who was a very cruel dragoon officer. A few years after this, he's actually court-martialed for brutally killing one of his men, and he gets off on a technicality. Colonel Harney of the Dragoon Regiment, the second in command of the regiment, said that Marshal Howe was a worthless, cruel officer and didn't like him very much there. Now, Colonel Harney, which I'll mention in a minute, the second in command of the regiment, the commander was Colonel Twiggs, David Twiggs. Colonel William S. Harney served 40 years in the Army as a very famous officer, but he's also known as very cruel. There's a scandal where he whipped to death one of his slaves in New Orleans. He had to flee to the west, and he's not looked very good at his treatment towards Native Americans either. And he almost started a war with the British in the Northwest. That's another story for another time. Colonel Harney, he was retired from the service during the middle of the Civil War by President Lincoln. You know, it's pretty bad when President Lincoln doesn't even want him in the war anymore. And Harney retired at a big house on Lake Eola in Orlando, Florida. Back to our story. January 10th. On the 10th, we sailed for Gary's Ferry, Florida, about 3 crazy schooners. Fell in with a British brig off St. Mary's. Very boisterous voyage. Arrived at Jacksonville on the 11th of January. Nice place, this Jacksonville. What a change in climate. Summer in the north not half so pleasant as this season here. A good many of our men gone ashore in Jack. They got drunk, of course. Lieutenant Howe released the men in F Company. On the 12th, arrived at Gary's Ferry. Gary's Ferry was known as the quartermaster depot during part of the war in Florida, also Fort Heilman. It's known by that as well, and is kind of a jumping off point after leaving Jacksonville, going up the St. Johns River, then up Black Creek, and stopping at Gary's Ferry, which is now Middleburg. And so that was an important point. And also, it was where the Dragoons would frequently be stationed, as we show here in a minute. On the 12th, arrived at Gary's Ferry. We were towed to Black Creek by steamboat. Saw Indians there. The famous Jim Boy was there, a fine-looking Creek Indian. Nothing of the least important happened to us from our leaving New York until our arrival here. We met Colonel Harney here, our future commander. Colonel Fanning here likewise. Colonel Fanning's with the 4th Artillery Regiment. Uh, Talk about the Creek Indian Regiment that they would go alongside with the Dragoons in Florida. 759 of them were enrolled, enlisted for service in Florida in September 1836 for a year. And both them and the Dragoons would go from Black Creek down to Fort Brooke in Tampa Bay, back and forth. The 13th got our carbines here. 14th left here for Volusia. The carbines that he's talking about are the breech loading Hall's rifle that the men really disliked, which we shall hear further on. We passed Piccolata, commanded by Captain Merchant, arrived at Volusia on the 15th. Romantic voyage from Black Creek to Volusia through St. John's and Lake George, impossible to paint it. Landed at Fort Barnwell, Volusia on the 16th of January with 4 companies of dragoons and 2 of artillery under Captain Smellin and Captain Vinton. Vinton, of course, did the sketch you see behind me. A company of dragoons were commanded by Captain Gordon and Lieutenant Hamilton. Lieutenant May, Lieutenant Kingsbury commanded Company G. Captain Anderson's Company F remained at Gary's Ferry as an escort to trains of wagons to Fort King, Fort Drane, Fort Micanopy, and so forth. Company A and Company I Dragoons came to Florida at this time from Virginia. Lieutenant McLaughlin of the Navy was with us in capacity of commissary, and Lieutenant George C. Thomas as quartermaster. Lieutenant McLaughlin later would become famous as head of the West Indies squadron out of Key West, searching for the Seminoles in the Everglades. Major Gardner commanded at Volusia. He had a very scanty garrison, the rough end of 2 companies of artillery and about 50 friendly Creek Indians under their chief, Paddy Carr. Pitched our tents here until the latter part of the month. Got orders to proceed to Lake Monroe. Started for Lake Monroe with 4 companies of dragoon, 2 artillery, Paddy Carr, and 39 friendly Indians, with a little captain of Marines called Percy, who made more noise about his exploits than ever his namesake, Hotspur, did. We landed on Lake Monroe on the 3rd day of February 1837 and encamped on the verge of the lake without opposition. We saw no signs of Indians whatsoever. We went to work immediately to build pickets. Colonel Harney and 160 dragooners went out on a scout supposed for 10 days, returned, however, the 2nd day and discovered no traces of Indians. A steamboat, we have of them 2 of them with us. The Santee and the Seance was dispatched to Piccolata with dispatches by Colonel Fanning. Lieutenants Thomas and McLaughlin got pretty considerable drunk here, to use a common phrase, and took a notion to ride into the woods to cool or amuse themselves and did not return to camp that night. February 6th, we are afraid that they lost themselves in the woods or were discovered by the Indians. They did discover Indians not 6 miles from our camp and had to hide themselves until morning to avoid discovery. In the morning, a party of dragooners under Colonel Harney went out to seek for them, but they, the lieutenants, came into camp from another direction and immediately told their discoveries. Colonel Harney was called back by signals. We were expecting to meet General Jessup and the main army every day. We had 20,000 rations for them. We immediately commenced building a breastwork around our camp, which was a square. Our pickets were not finished at the time, though they were pretty far advanced under the superintendence of Captain Vinton. Of course, you can see his handiwork behind my shoulder on the image there. We made the breastwork 3 logs high and did the same, very careless and unstable. Order of our camp. Captain Gordon's Company A were on the far right, Captain Graham, Company H, next to him. The 2 companies occupied the whole length of the right flank. Company E, Captain Bean, was next to H in the center or facing the woods. Company G, First Lieutenant Howe, next to E. The artillery occupying the left flank. Paddy Carr's Indians and a few horses picketed immediately between the breastworks and the unfinished pickets, a distance of about 300 yards. The tents of several companies were as close to the breastwork as they could be. The colonel's tent were in the middle of the square and the officers near them. On the evening of the 7th of February, so far from having any idea that the Indians were in our vicinity, we got orders to put wooden flints in our guns for the purpose of drilling. We got muskets at this time and the carbines taken from us. A wise and judicious job. One musket is worth two of them carbines, in action proved. About 5 o'clock in the morning of the 8th of February, Wednesday, the poor soldiers encamped on Lake Monroe were disagreeably surprised by hideous yelling and firing of over 600 savage Seminole Indians, led on by the celebrated Osceola, Philip, Cowacachi, Alligator, Jumper, and so forth. It's known that the attack was led by Philip and Cowacachi. It's uncertain whether Osceola, Alligator, and Jumper were with them or if they numbered as many as 600. But it makes a good story. Our sentinels, true to their trust, discovered them and gave the alarm by firing. What an awful scene. 8th of February, 1837, Battle of Lake Monroe. Our men flew out of their tents like lightning, some naked, some in their shirts only. Luckily, the greater part of them disobeyed the orders of the wooden flints coming from the wooded heads of the commanders, and they had their guns loaded too. No pen can describe the scene from that period until daylight. The sentries all got in safe. An extraordinary circumstance, Lieutenant Graham was officer of the guard. A volley was fired at the main guard as they sat around their guard fire, and strange to tell, not one of them were hurt, though the musket balls scattered the fire and ashes about their legs. The breastworks were heroically manned instantly. 300 muskets plied by willing and brave hands bid stern and awful defiance to overwhelming force by the savages. Reflect on the scene, the constant firing, hideous and disappointed, outrageous yelling of the 600 savages, the vigorous response of 300 brave fellows fighting for their lives, their animated hurrahs when confident that they could not be beaten by the savages, and led on by such a hero as Colonel Harney is, for with all his faults, a brave soldier never drew a sword, soldier never drew a sword in Florida. Colonel Fanning commanding, a cool soldier, a hero. Indians pertinaciously held on for 3 hours and a half without much lagging. They got into the unfinished pickets and from there galled our left flank. Paddy Carr's Indians and the doughty Captain Percy were of no use to us by this maneuver by the Indians. Captain Mellon fell in the beginning of the action, and never did I hear of any officer dying without evincing sympathy for some one of his company. But him, not a soldier that knew him, said God bless him. Notwithstanding, he was a very brave man. Lieutenant McLaughlin was severely wounded in the breast. No necessity, he got crippled in some duel or another. He was hardly able to walk without a stick in his hand. A pretty officer in the wilderness of Florida. That's a sarcastic remark there. Truly, we had 22 men wounded, most of them slightly. The officers behaved remarkably well, all things into consideration with a few exceptions. Harney was the life and love of the battle. Harney's bravery leads you back to the days of the crusade. He is in fact enthusiastic in battle. Colonel Fanning was as brave as ever an officer could be. Most awful morning, one of the horses was killed. I observed 12 or 13 rifle balls pass through Colonel Fanning's tent. All the tents were riddled by the enemy's balls. I can never think of that awful and sublime event without a shudder. Until this day, methinks that I hear the balls whiz, whiz by my ear strike against the logs of our little breastwork, as plain as I did on that memorable morning. Not that I felt any fear of being killed, the idea somehow never occurred to me, but the constant firing of 1,000 rifles and muskets, the reverberation across the bosom of the calm and placid beauty of Lake Monroe, the stillness, darkness of the hour, the smoke remaining solemnly around our camp where it is emitted, an occasional discharge of the 6-pounder from aboard the Santee in the lake, which was now plying at the enemy under the management of Lieutenant Thomas. The yells of the Indians, the animated hurrahs of the troop, the stake we were plying for, no more or less than beat the savages, or you are all indiscriminately massacred. Some person or persons who had been similarly situated can form an idea of the feeling of the recruit in his first battle, and that the Battle of Lake Monroe, Florida, on the 8th of February, 1837. Not an article of clothing that was lay out, but was riddled with bullets, not even a mess pan or camp kettle escaped. Through my cloak was passed 7 balls, as it lay on me on the breastwork. At 8:30, the firing ceased and the enemy retired into the woods. Colonel Harney would have gone out after them. Colonel Fanning would not allow it. His force was weak and no chance of reinforcing it, besides having 20,000 rations for the army to protect and our wounded being looked to. We immediately fell to strengthening our breastwork and finishing our pickets. And ere night, such was our perseverance and industry that we were willing, the night after the battle, to try the enemy again. The friendly Indians and 28 soldiers with Captain Percy and Patty Carr were placed in the pickets. Captain Percy was actually a Marine there, and the Marines were part of the Creek Regiment that time. All the Indians in Florida united could make no impression on us at this time, and everyone was anxious to have them try the game again. We heard 2 or 3 rifles fired at about 9 o'clock, mere bravado. They did not calculate to try their mettle again. Captain Mellon was buried late in the evening, not a gun fired over him, nor a drum beat. His cloak was his coffin. Captain Vinton made an oration on the occasion, very handsomely indeed. No man ever died a braver death. That's another sarcasm in his account. Alas, I am sorry to say that every man in his company was glad of his death. Too true. It would be the case in over half the companies in service if their officers shared the same fate. So much for the unnecessary tyranny. Colonel Fanning very justly called the fort afterwards after the brave deceased. And thus Camp Mellon it was originally named Camp Monroe on Lake Monroe and renamed Camp Mellon and later Fort Mellon after the late Captain Mellon, who was killed at the battle. I believe the only casualty at the battle too. On the 11th of February, Colonel Fanning congratulated us on the conclusion of hostilities, which he told us was over, and thanked us in a neat and appropriate speech for our conduct on the morning of the 8th. He was answered by 3 deafening cheers. On the same day, we embarked bag and baggage for Volusia, a treaty being made with the Indians, and then ended Colonel Fanning and Harney's first expedition to Lake Monroe. This is the truest account or narrative of the battle that has ever been penned, strict truth. And I'll end it there. What he's talking about the treaty is the Fort Day capitulation in early 1837 that was made between General Jessup and with McNopey and some of the other Seminoles. It only lasted a few months and nothing worthwhile really became of it, but was believed at that point the war was over. which it was not. It would go on another 5 years, and also um, two more, uh, 2.5 more years of miserable duty for Private Bartholomew Lynch. I hope you enjoyed this, and maybe I can do some more later.